Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about Witch King by Martha Wells. And oh my god, like, I absolutely love this book. I was a bit nervous when I picked it up because as much as I try to avoid ever seeing any reviews of books before I read them, this one was popular enough that, yeah, I happened upon a couple people's opinions and heard a little bit before I would click away. And I know that some people are saying this is not her best work and that, like, the characters, you can't connect to them and they're all a little bit weird, and I'm like, what are y'all talking about? I'm in love with this book. I'm obsessed. And, like, spoilers for the review ahead, like, the only complaint I have about this book is that it is, at least as of yet, a standalone, and I want there to be a book 2. Like, oh my god, give me a book 2, I need one. But all that aside, let me see if I can give you a coherent analysis and actually explain why I loved it so much. So Witch King is the story of Kai, who I'm absolutely in love with. Like, oh my god, he's exactly the kind of character that I absolutely love to see in a book. But no. Focus. Okay, so Kai is a demon who only exists in the world most of this book takes place in because he was given a body of a recently dead woman to live in. And he has since then jumped from body to body, and we start with him and his best friend slash ally, Zaidi. They're both buried alive in a crypt, trapped, unable to see or hear or experience anything. They cannot make contact with the outside world. They can barely make contact with each other. They are basically completely trapped. The only reason Kai has woken up is because there is an evil wizard who has appeared to try to take him as a familiar, which would basically mean he was a slave to this evil wizard who will use him for basically as a battery to his magic, but also to get him to do stuff. And he knows that they had to have been betrayed by someone. That is the only way they possibly could have been trapped here. But they don't know who or why they were betrayed. As soon as they escape, which of course they do, they need to find their other allies, including Zaidi's wife, Tayrin, and figure out who has betrayed them and why. Meanwhile, we are also getting chapters in the past where we get to see how Kai became who he is, somewhat literally, but also how he found this family and how this found family came together and how the world got to be in the place it is in when the book starts. And oh my god, I just loved it so much! I loved the characters, I loved the world, I loved the oddly shaped plot, I loved the writing, I loved the dual timelines. I think this is a book that does it better than most any other books I've read that do dual timelines. I just loved everything about this book, except the fact that it might be the only one. And I will admit this verges on not just me wanting more, but the book actually needing more. So I'm really hoping it has a sequel. And on that note, continuing my absolute incoherence of this review, someone on Threads actually told me while I was writing this review that they saw a few places listing this as Rising World Book 1, which implies there will be a book 2. I can't find anything that confirms that yes, there will be a book 2, but I'm super duper hopeful. And with all that out of the way, back to my review. Let's try to break this into specific categories. First, as usual, I'm going to talk about characters, because if you've ever watched any of my reviews, you know that characters are almost always what make or break a book for me. Like, you can pretty much just judge whether or not I'm going to like a book by whether or not I get attached to the characters. And these characters are so perfectly to my taste. The main characters all are beautifully complex and, in my opinion, super likable. And I mean, Kai pretty much does start the book by horrifically murdering some folks, but they were bad people. And so I swear, okay, like, I've seen some people refer to Kai as like a anti-hero, a villain, an evil person. No, he is an incredibly moral character. And, like, he is very upfront about what he sees as okay and what he sees as not okay. And also, he's been through a lifetime of basically war and trauma. So, yeah, it makes sense that when he does kill people, which most fantasy heroes do end up killing people, he is rather cold and basically upfront about it. He's very like, this needs to be done, okay, we do this, we move on. And he does express enjoyment of killing bad people. But to me, that does not really make him an anti-hero. It makes him slightly morally gray at worst. And what I really love about Kai is there is a very serious juxtaposition between this, like, cold, calculated, somewhat, like, cruel killer that we are introduced to in the very first, like, scene, but he almost immediately transitions into showing us his softer side, and there's something incredibly innocent about this character. Like, he is very disaffected, he very much does not trust people, he very much has, like, scars, but, like, there's so much about him, especially in the current timeline, that he's just so tired of betrayal and being feared by the people around him, and he just wants to be hugged and to be liked, and it's so sweet. And, like, I really love the fact that we get to see how much he has grown from the baby version of the character that we meet in the earliest sections of the past timeline, to the version that we see in the current timeline, while also maintaining the very solid through line that says this is the same character. It never feels like we're looking at a different character. There's a certain extreme impulsiveness and the obvious need to be loved and to be part of a community that really carry through the character all the way through the book and make him very coherent. And, like, Zaidi is definitely the next biggest character, and she does not have as big of a difference, an arc, between the earliest version we see to the current timeline version we see of her, but that makes sense for the character because she was already pretty mature and adult and stabilized in her personality by the time we meet her, whereas Kai really was little more than a child when we first meet him in this book. And, or at least by his people's standards. And Zaidi is incredibly powerful, while also being pretty vulnerable emotionally and, like, open. And I loved seeing the way the relationship between her and Tayrin develops, and it's really subtle and background, and I love the fact that at first glance it feels like they're going from hating each other to being interested a little bit too quickly, and then you sort of realize, or at least I realized, that no, that's not what's going on. They've known each other for quite a while, and the, like, enemies to lovers journey has been going on for quite a while, and it's just Kai is beginning to notice what's happening, which makes sense because he's only known them for a couple of days, and we're just beginning to see it strong enough that there's no ignoring it. And I love seeing that, honestly, a little bit tired plotline taken on a new angle from the outside, and, like, most of the, all of this book is from Kai's point of view, so we're not seeing it from Zaidi and Tayrin's point of view, and it makes it like watching them in the background, and it's so fucking cute. And then there's Dahin, which is probably, in my opinion, the most fascinating character from the main Found Family cast, and it's because he seems the most drastically different from the past to the current timeline, and we don't get a lot on page that explicitly explains the change. Like, basically there is one paragraph where Kai describes an incident that vastly warped his personality, and it's sort of vague, and it comes really late on in the book, and it gives us just enough to understand what's going on. And I'm all for seeing this angry, self-destructive nerd, comparing him to the sweet, innocent, hyper-focused nerd that we first meet, and it's just a really interesting examination of what trauma does to people, and what war does to people, and how it misshapes characters. And I love it, and that is a huge portion of what this book is doing across the entire book. Now, the characters who exist only in the current timeline do get just a little bit less development. One thing that I've found across the board when it comes to Martha Wells books is that she absolutely loves huge casts. Like, there'll be one or maybe two main characters, and then about 7 million secondary to tertiary characters. And all of them will get enough development that they feel like characters, they will have, like, noticeable personalities, but you don't get that much more because you can't. It's too big of a cast otherwise. And this book is no different. Everywhere Kai goes, he seems to be picking up more, like, random companions. And he rescues a random street kid, a witch, an entire troop of soldiers, an intelligence agent, and many of them do follow him throughout the entire current timeline. And, like, in the past, it's less him picking people up and more him just getting shoved into new groups. And Wells does a great job of giving us just enough about each of these characters to know who they are, to get a bit invested in them, to care, and to see how the relationships are developing, and also to use them to mirror to show us who Kai is. Like, a lot of the first sign that Kai is not the cold-blooded killer that you might think in the first chapter is how he's interacting with Sanja, the random street kid that he's picked up. He is so careful and so gentle with her, and the fact that he never pushes her is something you don't see a lot in characters, and it's a really nice way of showing that he has experienced trauma, he knows what it feels like, and he's not going to traumatize her more. Though, God bless, there were some names in this book that were just a bit too similar, and that is something I've also noticed in Martha Wells. Sometimes the names of characters will just be similar enough that I'm going, I don't remember which one that is. And this one in particular, some of the Arik, whatever they're called, some of them have names that are frankly too similar for me to remember who is who. But the most important thing I will discuss about the characters is their power. That is one thing about the characters in this book that's just so unusual. So they start the book as some of the most powerful magical beings, the most respected and the most feared magic users in this entire world. And even though, yes, fantasy leads just tend to be magically powerful characters, they usually start the story as underdogs who are going up against an unstoppable magic. And there's a reason one of the cliche fantasy tropes is the farm boy turned hero. It gives us someone we can side along, that we can feel powerless next to him, be like, ah, I know that feeling of feeling powerless, I will also agree with this character. And quite often the entire story of most fantasy novels is that character discovering their own power, building that power, growing into it. And while there certainly is a good bit of that in the past timeline in this book, the current is almost the exact opposite. We start with incredibly powerful characters and sort of gradually learn their weaknesses across the book. And I sort of love it. Partially just because it is so unusual, but also because while they are powerful, Kai and Zaidi are also clearly very vulnerable magically. Like, they have faults that are exploited by people around them, that a lot of people around them seem to know their faults, their flaws, their weaknesses. They have, like, serious stakes and serious danger. And they also have to be very clever and careful about how they use their magic to achieve their goals. They are both brought low. We see them at weak points, and they have to keep fighting. And it's just so unusual. And I do think that the reason this works and doesn't undercut the stakes is because we get those past sections. Like, I feel like if this was just all the current, we wouldn't really be able to connect to them because we wouldn't see how they got to the strength that they have now. And Kai in particular, who is the one who is almost indestructible in the present. Like, it is hard to take him down. He's constantly struggling in the past. And Zaidi, who actually seems significantly more unbeatable in the past, is the one we see desperately needing help in the present. And it's just this very wonderful balance of powerful but vulnerable that makes the characters really interesting, different, and in my opinion, just an interesting examination of how even the most powerful are still innately very vulnerable. But I also think that one of the reasons this works is because the actual quest is one that they have either already won or already lost before they even start. Both in an obvious way and a less obvious way. I'm not going to tell you about the less obvious way because it would be major spoilers, but the obvious way is from the very beginning. Like, it is sometimes even pretty closely to directly stated that when it comes to rescuing Taran, Taryn, however you pronounce her name, it is either inevitable that they're going to do it, like they are going to get there, or she's already dead. And there is no in between. There is no feeling that they might almost get there before she dies. Like, no, it is very much a we've either won or we've lost. And in a way, that means that the stakes of the journey are undercut. But that's because the actual quest is not really the real crux of this book. So yeah, these characters can kick the ass of 90% of the people that they meet along the way, but that's less important than the emotions going on behind the journey. This book is far more about dealing with the results of being seen as monsters by a huge portion of society than it is about just an epic quest to rescue someone. And that's also why, I will warn you, the plotting of this novel is weird. Like, the structure just does not feel like a normal fantasy novel. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more later, but I want to talk about a bit about world building before I get to that. As usual, Wells's world building here is impeccable. In my opinion, that is her strength as an author. She builds the most amazing, weird, expansive, vast, and deep worlds. Now, because her worlds are so incredibly full, it does take a while to get into them. Like, every single one of the Wells books I've ever read, you do spend a good bit in the beginning having no idea what's going on, just because there's so much that has to be introduced to you. And you do sort of have to go into it with a sense of like, okay, I'm not really going to understand what the world's like for a couple of pages. That's fine. That's fine. As long as I get the characters and can understand the action, we can move forward until we get the explanation. And there's so much going on in this book that, like, even in the last quarter of the book, you're still getting exposition. You're still getting world building. You're still learning new things about this world. And I love it. Also, this world is just so interesting. Each culture we come across has been clearly thought out and explored. Like, it's clear none of these were the sort of filler, vague fantasy norm cultures that you see in a lot of fantasy books. And this is not me trash talking those. Like, I am perfectly fine with books that focus more on the character and the plotting, and so purposefully choose a world that feels very familiar and less in need of explanations. Worlds that are either leaning so heavily on our actual history that you could just be like, yep, I know what's going on, or are so clearly just the pseudo-medieval, pseudo-European world that like 90% of fantasy is set in. Those books don't really need a lot of world building. You sort of know what's going on. You just need enough explanation to know what's different about that world building. And Wells does not do that. Like, even the small side cultures, every single one is very different. Even if we'll be spending only like a chapter or two with a people or in a place, they will have a complex way of interacting. There will be complex ways of dressing that are explained to us. We'll have a complex city design and how the homes are set up and the ways of interacting with gender, because yes, the different ways of interacting with gender are a big part of the cultures in this book, and it's fascinating and fun and definitely worth a read. And yes, we will have all that stuff in this book. Like, the Arik are wildly different from the Seridi? I'm gonna mispronounce all these places. They're wildly different than the Inalin, who are wildly different than the Immortal Blessed, and they all clearly do take inspirations from common fantasy races, cultures, and species, and real-world history, but they're also nothing like anything I've seen in other books. And the demons and witches and the expositors are all clearly taking inspiration from more common mythology. Like, the expositors are really sort of necromancers. But they're all shifted, like, slightly away from the expected in a really deeply committed way. Like, it's not just a, yes, they're demons, but they're nice. We're not really going to go into details on that. Everything is deeply explored. Everything is thought out. And it's very clear that Wells has very much thought about all the whys here. And like the demons in this book, they come from the Under-Earth, which is a lot like, you know, the concept of demons from hell. They are born in a sort of reptilian horned shape, which isn't unlike the way demons have been pictured in the past. And they do possess human bodies and can do what we would in the real world call, like, dark magic. But in this book, They are not inherently evil. This is not hell. The Underearth is something very different. They have allegiances with the people whose bodies they take, and are deeply respectful of the human who inhabited the body before they got it, and they're just manipulating energy and like the way that most magic in this world is. So everything is very carefully thought out and explained, and just like at first glance looks like what you expect from mythology. And on the Underearth, oh my god, it is so cool. It's described as both physical and just energy, and the way characters move through it is fascinating. But also, like, in the Upper Earth, the main world, it is super cool the way that Wells shows us the world in different perspectives through how Kai sees it in the past and how Kai sees it in the present. And, like, there's a lovely bit of mirroring very near the end, in the last few chapters, when Kai in the past and Kai in the present are both arriving at the same fort in chapters right after each other. And both times we get a full physical description of the place, and it follows the same patterns, like we go from describing the wall to the chair to whatever, but also a lot of the sentence structures mirror the previous ones. The description is very similar, but there's just enough of a difference to tell us how much Kai has changed in the intermediary time, and that Kai knows so much more in the present. He knows what everything is for, and so it's not just a weird, unusual place. He's describing what each thing is used for. And like, we get what is common versus what is unusual for this place. We get how the physical place interacts with history, and all these other sorts of things that past Kai did not know at all. And it's just so well done, and it builds layers and layers into the world building. And I will admit, that bit of mirroring comes in a moment that feels just odd. This moment in the book feels like we should be heading into the climax, and so it feels like it's a badly timed moment to have something more slow and introspective happening. But the thing is, we aren't actually heading into the climax. And here's where I really need to talk about the plotting of this book. I'm going to try my best to discuss this without any major spoilers, but it's going to be a bit hard, so I apologize if I get a little vague. So this book definitely does have a climax, but it's not where you expect it to be. Nor does it look like how one expects a climax in a fantasy book to look. There are big battles near the end of the book, both in the past and the present timeline, but neither of them are really the climax. The climax is surprisingly quiet and emotional, and I think it really works, but at least I didn't even realize I had hit the climax until it was already over. Like, I did not notice that I had had the climax until I was in Falling Action and realized there wasn't enough pages left for a traditional climax to exist. And I sort of paused and sat back and realized what I had just read was the climax of the book. And there is action after the climax, but in my opinion, it's very definitely Falling Action. This is not climax. This is, like, if we're mapping this book out, like most books, you know, you get a couple of hillocks and then the giant one and dump down, and the climax here, it just doesn't, it sort of slides by unnoticed, and then you have a little extra hillock at the end of more action. And most of the action that takes place after the climax, I think partially to impart that this is not the climax, it doesn't really feel like there's much danger. There are not much stakes. A lot of it takes place off page, and it just feels like an inevitable, like, completed thing. And so because of that, you realize when you get to the end of it, wait, that was not climactic action. And the actual climax of this book is a conversation. It's not even an argument. It's a conversation. And that's weird. But the thing is, I do think it works in this book. The book is more about the betrayals and choosing sides and making allegiances than it is about fighting battles. It's about the aftermath of war and heading into war, not the war itself. And it's strangely beautiful. And when I got to the end, it did feel fulfilled. Because the book is so much the character arcs of trauma. But Christ, do I want more of this book. And I do feel like the plot points mostly got resolution. Like, this is not a book that feels incomplete. Like, I'm not sitting here going, oh, well, that was a cliffhanger. No, it's nothing like that. And I will get to the mostly, I'm going to explain it in a minute. But it's just one of those resolutions that, in my opinion, works significantly better as the first in a duology or a trilogy than as a standalone book. The shape of it feels just odd enough that it makes you stop and think about things, and I think that is mostly an absolute positive here, but I can see how some people would walk out of this going, where was the climax? But also helping this book feel resolved is the fact that the two plot lines start to come together in odd little ways. Like, it starts out basically just the way that most past timelines start out, with the main character being reminded of the past and we just see a segment of the past. But then we are just following along with that story as well, and eventually we start to see the past foreshadowing what is about to happen in the present, and the characters start to act more like their present versions, so it feels like things are just aligning more, and then they start developing the relationships that we see in the present, and then we start to end up in the same place in the past, and then in the present, and at the exact same time, the events are bringing them to vastly different outcomes. One outcome is one of hope and coming together and strength and joy, and the other is betrayal and pulling away, and it makes it so much more heartbreaking. And speaking of heartbreaking, I did mention there was one thing, or I said mostly, that it had good resolution. There is one thing that, if this ends up being a standalone, I will be upset. And that is Kai's romantic subplots. He has two of them, one in the past, one in the present, and one has something that could definitely count as a solid ending. It's a upsetting ending, but it's an ending, and the other, we don't get any resolution whatsoever. Like, there's a moment that feels like it's about to head into that traditional end of the book, like, admission of feelings and clinch, maybe even a kiss, and then we just don't go there. No, we move on. And if that is all the resolution Kai gets romantically, I'm gonna be upsetty spaghetti. And I'm perfectly happy if it's confirmed that the relationship is fully platonic, or romantic but not sexual, or even if it's confirmed later that it is fully one-sided, but I need some form of resolution, other than Kai quietly admitting in the present that there was a relationship. And I need more than that, especially considering this relationship shaped so much of not just Kai's life, but the world as we see it. So I will admit, in that one way, if this does end up being a standalone, I will feel it is unfulfilled. But everything else, if this is a standalone, yeah, I want more, but I don't need more. And I really do honestly feel that this book, Wells definitely intends there to be a second book here. I mean, she is prone to unusual plotting, but it would be a bit odd to have a standalone book that is so thoroughly about building up to a war that we never actually see on page. And I want to see that war that led to the Rising World. I want to know what happened after the Imperial Renewal. I want to know what happens next for Ramad. Very much I want to know what happens next for him. And like, I want to know where Sanja and Tenez end up. I want more. And I hope I get it. And it feels like there is more story to be told here. But even if I don't get it, in the end, I loved this book. This is honestly my new favorite book. This is going to be one that ends up on all my lists for the future as absolute faves. And I've already been looking up, like, fan art for it, and it's a problem because turns out when you search Witch King fan art, you just get a lot of Tolkien. So, yeah, fan artists out there, please, give a girl a solid, do some pretty fan art. I need to know more, I need to see more, give me more.